Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetics satire podcast. I'm Will England. You're listening to the Rock Solid Apologia show. The year is 1924, and a young Adolf Hitler is in prison for treason. While in prison, the failed artist and future dictator begins working on a book that will become Mein Kampf, and in it he writes the infamous words, "Hence today I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jews, I am fighting for the work of the Lord." I welcome Dr. Richard Weikart, Emeritus Professor of History at California State University, Stanislaus, and author of From Darwin to Hitler, Hitler's Ethic, the Nazi Pursuit of Evolutionary Progress, Hitler's Religion, the Twisted Ideas That Drove the Third Reich. I have that book in front of me. And The Death of Humanity and the Case for Life. In his most recent book, Darwinian Racism, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. Dr. Weikart joins me to discuss the beliefs that drove Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party towards global catastrophe in the middle of the 20th century. Professor, a very warm welcome to you and congratulations on the new book. We return.
Thanks for having me. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you on the show. We return to Hitler's infamous words in Mein Kampf. Did Adolf Hitler believe he was fighting the Jewish people on behalf of the Christian God?
Yeah, well, there's a famous statement in Mein Kampf where Hitler says, I'll actually read it out of here. It says, "Hence today I believe that I'm acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I'm fighting for the work of the Lord." And that's actually one of the most commonly quoted references from Mein Kampf. And people use that to try to suggest that Hitler had some kind of Christian affinities or something like that. But very interestingly, if you read the context to it, it says something a little bit different. Although he uses this term Almighty Creator, the sentence immediately in front of that says this: "Eternal nature inexorably avenges the infringement of her commands." Eternal nature. And so here he's really deifying nature. And interestingly, the translator of Mein Kampf actually does capitalize the word nature in a number of contexts, including right here, suggesting that the translator thinks that this is more than just nature as most of us think of it, and knows that Hitler was sort of deifying nature here. So when he's talking about the Almighty Creator there, he's not talking about some creator outside of nature. He's talking about nature itself.
So I also picked up from your work along a similar line here that Adolf Hitler despised, hated the Old Testament. What was his rationale for that? What was it about the Old Testament that made Hitler angry?
It was Jewish, and he hated everything Jewish. And so he even went to the extent of, because he hated everything Jewish, he even denied that Jesus was Jewish because he had this positive image of Jesus. But his positive image of Jesus is as the opponent of the Jews. And so Hitler's favorite story about Jesus is Jesus driving the Jews out of the temple because, of course, it portrays the Jews as being money-grubbing, greedy Jews. And Jesus then is coming out in opposition to them as this Aryan fighter. And so Hitler believed that Jesus had Aryan blood in him. He thought he was fathered. He didn't believe in the virgin birth. He believed he was fathered by a Roman soldier, and that the Roman soldier had Aryan blood. And so this made Jesus an Aryan hero who was then opposing the Jews during his day. But in terms of the Old Testament that you asked about, is simply that it was Jewish, and he believed that he criticizes specific stories of the Old Testament as he believes illustrating this stereotype of the Jews as being greedy and such. And so he basically opposes anything that has to do with the Jews.
And you said he thought Jesus was Aryan and Jesus was not Jewish.
Correct. That's his view, yes. Now, they might have admitted that Jesus had some Jewish blood in him, but they believe that he may have had, Mary, his mother may have been a Jew, but they think he had an Aryan father that gave him enough Aryan blood that put him in opposition to the Jews. Yeah.
Did Hitler get that story of a Roman father from someone else, or did Hitler come up with that himself?
I don't think Hitler had any unique ideas of his own at all. Just about every idea that I've found in Hitler's speeches and in his writings come from other anti-Semitic and racist thinkers that preceded Hitler. And in my books, Hitler's Religion especially, I identify a lot of those thinkers who did come before Hitler.
So nothing particularly original with Hitler. He wasn't a particularly philosophizing type in and of the sense he was original, coming up with new ideas.
No, he actually did read quite widely, and he had a very sharp memory. A lot of his colleagues were astonished by his memory. So he had an amazing memory, but he doesn't really seem to have any unique ideas. Most of them are drawn from he puts them together maybe in unique ways. I mean, he takes a little bit from here and a little bit from there. He doesn't just draw from one thinker. He draws from a lot of different thinkers. And so he puts them together in a little bit different ways than any particular thinker would. But if you look at any particular idea, it's going to come from some other thinker preceding him.
So we mentioned the Old Testament, mentioned Jesus. What did Hitler think of the Pauline epistles?
Interestingly, he rejected the Pauline epistles also because he thought that Paul was a sneaky Jewish rabbi who had corrupted Christianity from the start. So he had this idealized notion of Jesus as this Aryan hero that he thought was sort of good, but then he thought Christianity had become corrupted from the very start by Paul. And Paul was this rabbi who he thought had snuck in all these Jewish ideas into Christianity. He also, and again, this is not unique to Hitler. Many anti-Semites in the early 20th century, were saying similar things. They rejected parts of the Gospels also. So, for example, in John chapter 4, Jesus said that salvation is of the Jews. They, of course, totally reject that. They don't believe that's legitimate or anything. So there are parts of the Gospels they are selective about as well, but the Pauline epistles completely reject.
So rejection of the Old Testament, rejection of certain parts of the Gospel, and rejection of the Pauline epistles. So, I mean, right there, you got most of the Bible thrown out in the mind of Adolf Hitler.
Correct.
So let's go through a little bit and chronicle the beliefs of Adolf Hitler and where they come from. I wanted to start with a man named Ernest Haeckel, whom contemporaries you cite in your work suggest have very similar beliefs to those that Hitler had. So who is Ernest Haeckel? What does he believe? And what was his connection with the Third Reich?
Yeah, Ernst Haeckel was a German Darwinian biologist. He was the leading Darwinian biologist in the late 19th century. And I don't want to push it too far. I mean, it's not like Hitler got all of his ideas from Haeckel, but he did get some key ideas from Haeckel and from other biologists and anthropologists who were basically following Haeckel's lead in the late 19th century. Essentially, Haeckel believed that races had evolved to different levels. And he believed that the European races had evolved to the highest level of any of the human races. Hitler, of course, was going to call that Aryan. Haeckel didn't use that terminology. But the so-called Aryan race that Hitler was going to talk about, he believed was superior to every other race on the globe. And Hitler did believe that they had evolved differently to these levels, and that's why they were different and why there were superior and inferior races. But it also was the fact that Haeckel believed that these different races were locked in the Darwinian struggle for existence. And that's going to be a crucial part of Hitler's belief set as well, that human races are in a Darwinian struggle for existence and that the superior need to exterminate the inferior in order to maintain and promote the evolutionary progress of the human species. And so he believes there's the food supply cannot expand fast enough for the growing population, and thus you're going to have this competition between the races. And so he believes that it's either them or us, so to speak, in what he's thinking about races locked in struggle. And at one point, Hitler even makes the comment that whereas the Marxists believe in class struggle as sort of their fundamental idea. He believes in racial struggle as being the fundamental idea of society.
So Ernest Haeckel was a Darwinist, I believe.
Yes.
What were Darwin's views on race, and how did they compare with those of Haeckel and those of Hitler?
Well, Darwin was also very racist, although interestingly, not quite as racist as Haeckel, because Darwin believed that all the different human races were part of one species, but he did think that those human races had diverged throughout evolutionary history and that they were locked in a Darwinian struggle for existence. Darwin, for example, talked about the disappearance of the Australian Aborigines and such as being part of the Darwinian struggle for existence. And so he believed that the Europeans were going out through their imperialist exploits of his day, and that they were essentially showing the superiority of the Europeans, and that this then was going to bring about an evolution within the human race. So Darwin actually used racism as a way to try to prove his theory, because he thought that species had to have lots of variation within them. In fact, if you look at Darwin's Origin of Species, the first two chapters are on variation within biological species. The first chapter is on variation under domestication. The second chapter is under variation in nature. And so you have to have lots of variation in order for evolution to happen. And so when he looked at the human species, and Darwin, after he wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, but in 1871, he published his book about human evolution. In that book, he argues that races show the wide variation within the human species. And he thought that other races, especially like the Black Africans, were inferior intellectually to the Europeans. And that because of that, he thought they ultimately were going to lose the struggle for existence with the white Europeans, who were then going to drive the evolutionary process forward. Now, interestingly, Haeckel was even more racist than Darwin was. Darwin was very racist, but Haeckel was even more racist, because Haeckel argued that humans should be divided into 10 different species of biologically. Darwin said we're all part of one species, but have all these, what Darwin would have considered the races as subspecies. Haeckel actually says they're totally distinct species.
So Haeckel took it one step further than Darwin did. I don't remember if this was referenced in your work, but I was listening to something from the Discovery Institute in which they had interviewed you, or you were a part of, talking about a German general by the name of, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, but Lothar von Troffer, and the genocide of the Herero people. Was that motivated by Darwinian racial ideas?
Yeah, Trota even specifically mentions Darwinian evolution as a reason for the racial wars that are going on. What had happened is in 1904, there was the Herero revolt against German rule in German Southwest Africa, which is today Namibia. And Trota was the general in charge of the German army trying to suppress the revolt. And they did practice, this is considered by many historians the first episode of genocide in the 20th century, from 1904 to 1906, as they suppressed the Herero revolt there. They actually did round some up and put them in concentration camps. They drove many of them into the desert to try to kill them of starvation and such. And there was a huge death rate for the Hereros at that time. And Trota specifically said that this was this race war was part of the Darwinian struggle for existence.
And would Darwin himself have necessarily condemned this? I mean, I know some Darwinists would say, like, oh, social Darwinism is a perversion of Darwinism. Would Darwin himself have been opposed to these kinds of activities?
Well, Darwin actually does use the European imperialism and, again, the extermination of races as evidence that he thinks the human species is evolving and changing, and that the European race is outstripping the others in this competition. So I'm not sure how he would oppose that. He also, in one of his letters, actually makes a comment about how the British are beating the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. That's the term that he uses in this letter. So he actually was rather exultant about the Europeans going out and even exterminating other races. I'm not saying he was cheering it on necessarily, but he certainly saw it as a positive development.
So he certainly would have been a social Darwinist. And then how is social Darwinism? I mean, I hear the term thrown around quite a bit. How would you define it, or how do scholars define that term?
Yeah, social Darwinism is simply applying the struggle for existence, the Darwinian struggle for existence, to human society. And so it's bringing humans under the standard of the struggle for existence. And Darwin certainly did that with races, clearly, as I've already mentioned. But interestingly, while I was doing my dissertation research back in the 1990s, I came across a letter that Darwin wrote, and I subsequently published this in the ISIS, which is the leading history of science journal. And in this letter, Darwin talks about how he's opposed to unions and co-ops and other things like that because it minimizes competition in human society. And so Darwin was also a social Darwinist in relation to within human society as well. He thought there should be as much competition as possible. He also opposed in his Descent of Man, he opposed primogeniture, which is the idea that inheritance should go to the firstborn of the person who's passing on their wealth. And he opposed that because he says the firstborn may not be the most fit. They may not be the best or the most superior specimen. So he did promote certain kinds of policies that he thought would help sharpen competition and bring about evolution in human society. So that does make him clearly a social Darwinist.
What's interesting about that, and I hadn't thought about it before, but if he promotes competition, communism as a system doesn't seem to work in his framework of the laws of nature.
No, and there actually were some Darwinists in the late 19th century, Ernst Haeckel being the most prominent of them, who were actually arguing against socialism on the basis of Darwinism. And now, on the other hand, interestingly, most socialists did embrace evolution in the late 19th century, but many of them rejected Darwinian evolution. They promoted some other kind of evolution, usually Lamarckian forms of evolution. In fact, that's what I did my actual dissertation on. My dissertation was called Socialist Darwinism, Evolution in German Socialist Thought from Marx to Bernstein. And so I showed that Marx, for example, and Engels also, although they loved the idea of evolution because it got rid of God from the process of creation, nonetheless, they hated the idea of Darwinism specifically because it implied competition in human society. And certainly they didn't want to apply to human society. In fact, Marx himself actually was promoting the ideas of a French thinker named Pierre Trémaux, who's hardly ever heard of today. Hardly anyone knows about Pierre Trémaux anymore. But Pierre Trémaux was promoting a kind of biological evolution that was based on geological strata and such, that sort of the geology of a particular place would determine how things would evolve biologically in the species. And because that was an environmental explanation for evolution, Marx tended to like that explanation much better than the Darwinian struggle for existence.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Great War before we turn to World War II, talk about World War I. In particular, a general in the Austrian army named Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, who, as I understand it, believed that war was a necessary component of the Darwinian system. And when he went to war, he applied his Darwinian ideas to waging World War I.
Yes, Hötzendorf was the leading general in Austria, and he, together with other generals, he wasn't the only one. There were other generals who were prominent, who were promoting this idea that War is inevitable because it's part of the Darwinian struggle for existence. And this was being taught by biologists, too, at the time. This is not something that these generals were just getting out from thin air. There were biologists at the time that were teaching that war was an inevitable consequence of the struggle for existence. And so Hertzendorf sort of took that to what he saw as a logical conclusion, that if war is inevitable, then basically he thought we need to fight it at the best opportune time for us in Austria. And so that's one of the reasons why he actually supported war in 1914. And again, he wasn't the only one. There were others promoting that same general idea. I'm not trying to say that Darwinism was the only or maybe even the major cause of World War I, but it was an underlying cause that did motivate some people to press for war now rather than later.
So were those ideas still prevalent come the Third Reich? The idea that war is necessary?
Certainly among the Nazis they were. Hitler was going to embrace that same exact idea, that war was a necessary consequence of well, let me back up. Part of the notion of the Darwinian struggle for existence is based upon Malthus's population idea. And Malthus's population idea was that the population tends to expand faster than the food supply. So that means that there's inevitable competition for scarce resources. And Darwin said that because of that, this causes a struggle for existence among organisms, and this competition then leads to higher evolution. Hitler and many others were going to say that because of this population imbalance, the population growing faster than the food supply, this means either we need to take over more land so we can get more food supply, or kill off other peoples or whatever to gain greater food resources one way or another. So yeah, they did see war and gaining of territory, especially Hitler was specifically going to apply this to gaining more land, that was a necessary part of the Darwinian struggle for existence. And again, they didn't just get this out of thin air. There was a prominent Darwinian biologist named Friedrich Ratzel, who after getting his PhD in biology became a geographer, and he coined the term Lebensraum, which is the German word for living space, that Hitler was going to take over and decide that he needed more living space for the German people.
So there was a real, population will expand faster than food will, and unless we take over more land, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, and of course, part of that taking over land is you have to push out the peoples that are already there. So that's also part of essentially exterminating or forced emigration of the peoples that are in those territories so that your population can thrive.
And were there Darwinians who were opposed to these notions that did not think that war was a necessary component at the time?
Yeah, interestingly, Darwin himself actually had this vague hope that somehow war would be overcome in the future. He was hoping that the competition could be carried on in different ways. He still wanted competition, but he wasn't necessarily a fan of warfare as the means of the competition. However, Darwin did believe that warfare had, over the course of history, been a contributing factor to the Darwinian struggle for existence. He specifically mentions war as a factor in the struggle for existence. Thinking of the future, though, Darwin he hoped that warfare could be overcome at some point. There also were others who expressed that same viewpoint, but really the more dominant view among Darwinian biologists was the view that war was inevitable and necessary.
Interesting. So then also mid 20th century, we have Friedrich Nietzsche writing that God is dead. His famous quote. Did Adolf Hitler believe that? Was Hitler's morality derived from some sort of a god, or was it a god in Hitler's own image?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. For one thing, interestingly, Hitler did pay lip service to Nietzsche in a lot of ways, but like a lot of people who embrace Nietzsche's philosophy, even still today, they were very selective about the parts of Nietzsche that they took. And so he loved Nietzsche's talks about will to power and domination and other kinds of things like that. Nietzsche wasn't really a racist or nationalist, though, that Hitler was staunchly nationalist and racist, too. So again, they're sort of picking and choosing what they want out of Nietzsche's corpus. I don't believe Hitler was an atheist, though, in the way that Nietzsche was, because Hitler does exalt nature to this position of God. And that's a position that's generally referred to as pantheism, the notion that everything is God, or that nature is God. And Hitler does seem to deify nature in a lot of ways. But in where he's going to get his morality from, then nature. He gets his morality from nature, and that's pretty clear. He claims that the Darwinian struggle for existence is the pattern that he wants to pattern his morality on. And so I've written an entire book called Hitler's Ethic, where I look at the morality in Hitler's worldview. And essentially, it's whatever promotes the Darwinian struggle for existence and promotes the human evolution that he thinks is good. Anything that leads to the helping the weak and the sick and the disabled to propagate the species, that's bad. And so that's his basic measure of morality, is whatever helps the Darwinian evolutionary process along to higher levels of evolution, that becomes the good, and that's what he's trying to promote. And that's why he wants to promote things like warfare and expansionism, and why he wants to sterilize people with disabilities, which the Nazis do. And then they end up killing people with disabilities too during World War II. That's all an attempt to try to drive evolution forward. And again, these were not ideas that were unique to the Nazis. These are sometimes referred to as eugenics, the idea that we're going to improve human heredity. And this notion of eugenics was very prominent in the United States, which had compulsory sterilization as well. Hitler's was going to be more fanatical and radical in that they were going to sterilize more people. They were going to end up killing people also in their so-called euthanasia program. But still, these were ideas that he was building upon that were actually common in a lot of other Western countries as well.
So he was pantheistic. Nature was his God, but his understanding of nature was at least somewhat Darwinian.
Oh, definitely Darwinian, clearly Darwinian. He's talks extensively in his in Mein Kampf. Also, his second book is even clearer. His second book is simply called Hitler's Second Book because it was never published during his lifetime and never had a title that was given to it while he was around. So it's simply referred to as Hitler's Second Book. If you read those books, he clearly describes biological evolution and the struggle for existence that's going on between races. And he makes very clear, he doesn't use the word Darwin or Darwinian, and a lot of atheists will latch onto that and say, see, he's not really talking about Darwin or Darwinism. But if you read what he actually says, he's describing the evolutionary process, and he's describing it in clear Darwinian terms, that he's describing the struggle for existence that's going on because the population is expanding faster than the food supply. That's all detailed in Mein Kampf as well as in his second book, and in also many speeches as well. And I bring up lots of evidence for that in my book, Hitler's Ethic, where I show again and again how Hitler is referencing Darwinian evolution and showing that he believed in the Darwinian evolution. Just for an example, actually in his table talks, and by the way, I should say too that some atheists will point out that the table talks that are published in English are probably based on a fabrication to some degree, and they will then see, you can't rely on Hitler's table talks. Well, actually, there are two German editions which are not based on those bad manuscripts, and those are what I rely on in my work. I don't rely on the English translation. But the German editions, there's two of them. Both of the German editions agree in most respects, although some have parts that are left out of one or the other. But still, they agree on the parts that they do have in the same sayings. And both of those are every bit as anti-Christian and pro-Darwinian as the English table talks there. So don't rely on the English table talks. Read the original German. But in any case, in my book, Hitler's Ethic, I quote from them extensively, showing that Hitler very clearly, for example, in October of 1942, I believe, if I recall correctly, Hitler was talking about how he had learned about Darwinian evolution in school when he was younger, and schoolboy, and how this completely demolished the ideas of Christianity that he was being taught in his religion classes. And he would try to pit the Darwinian evolution against the religion in the classes that he was taking at the time. They had mandatory religion classes in German schools at that time, in Austrian and German schools at that time.
So Hitler, his first writing was Mein Kampf, right?
Yes.
I have heard one of my history teachers said that Mein Kampf was so boring that nobody ever read it, and if people had, they might have said, maybe we got to look out a little bit more for this guy." But I've never read that. I've never read Mein Kampf myself, so I couldn't say.
Well, actually, there's a German book that came out. I don't remember exactly when, 10 or 12 years ago, about Mein Kampf, which just looks at the publishing history of Mein Kampf, which looks at the readership of Mein Kampf, and he actually disputes that notion by claiming that there were a lot of Germans in the 1920s and 30s who did read Mein Kampf, and he has a lot of evidence to support that. Of course, not everyone is reading it because they agree with it. The ardent Nazis would read it because they agreed with it, and the most ardent Nazis considered it sort of their Bible, so to speak. So Mein Kampf was pretty widely read by avid Nazis. There also were anti-Nazis who were reading it, of course, to find out what Hitler believed about things and such. And there actually were, in this book that I'm referencing by the German scholar, he actually talks about a lot of Marxists who were pointing out Hitler's radicalism in Mein Kampf. Interestingly, a lot of the American and British and French thinkers, especially in the early 1930s when Hitler rises to power, basically thought that Mein Kampf was a radical treatise that Hitler probably had put behind him and wasn't really seriously going to implement at that point. So they didn't really take Mein Kampf very seriously. Actually, most of what's in Mein Kampf, Hitler does try to implement one way or another. But a lot of French, American, and British thinkers didn't really take it that seriously, didn't think that was going to happen.
So during Hitler's rise to power and then his subsequent years in power, what did the German church make of Adolf Hitler? And then what did Adolf Hitler make of the church?
Okay, the German church was divided into two main segments. The Catholic Church had about 1/3 of the population. They were mainly in Bavaria and in the Rhineland region. And then there was the Protestant churches, and they were going to have a differential treatment of Hitler. The Catholic churches were actually more opposed to Hitler than the Protestant churches were, in part because they were more tied to traditions and they were more conservative than the Protestant churches were at the time. Hitler also was going to get far less support in the votes in Catholic areas of Germany. Protestantism was largely liberal in its theology by the early 20th century. And so the liberals really didn't take the Bible very seriously. They sort of picked and chose what they liked out of the Bible and thought most of it was unhistorical and unscientific and other kinds of things. And so the Protestant liberals were generally able to sort of adapt to whatever the latest view was of science or politics or society or whatever. And so when Hitler came along, there actually were quite a number of liberals who lined up with Nazism and embraced the Nazi cause and promoted even Nazi ideals. There were those within the Protestant church who did oppose Nazism, people like Karl Barth, the Swiss-German theologian who was at the University of Bonn when the Nazis came to power and then was removed from his post by the Nazis, went to Switzerland. And he was going to be a staunch opponent of the Nazi regime. He actually was a socialist also, which put him politically at odds with the Nazis, but he didn't embrace the Nazi anti-Semitism and other things. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was another key figure who was opposed to Nazi anti-Semitism and such. So there were some voices out there in opposition, but a lot of the Protestant church was actually going to fall in line with the Nazi ideas.
And then how did Hitler look at the church? Did he view it as loyal base? Did he see it as something to be destroyed? How did Adolf Hitler look at the church?
Well, as a politician, and this is clear, and I bring this out in my book, Hitler's Religion, Hitler on several occasions told people privately that he didn't want to destroy the church, to publicly state his opposition to the churches, just because it wasn't a good political move. It would stir up too much animosity against him. And he'd actually seen that happen in Austria. In Austria, there'd been a pan-German nationalist political leader who had come out against the Catholic Church. And because of that, his political career had gone into a tailspin. And so Hitler didn't want that to happen. So for political purposes, he tried to avoid attacking the churches much publicly, especially before he came to power. Once he came to power, though, he tried to bring the churches under his control as much as possible. He signed a concordat with the Catholic Church in July 1933, which cut a deal with the Catholic Church where the Catholic Church had to pledge that they would not get involved in politics, and he would allow them to have their youth groups and, appoint their leaders and other things like that. Later on, he reneged on a number of those promises, like shutting down Catholic youth groups and their schools and things. So he didn't keep that promise, but again, he tried to bring the Catholic Church under control as much as he could. Protestantism, likewise, he tried to bring under control by getting a German Christian leader. And the German Christian movement was an anti-Semitic wing of the Protestant church. He tried to get him appointed as the leading bishop of the Protestant church and was successful in doing that in July 1933 in the church elections. And so he was basically trying to control and dominate the church as much as he could. But then once World War II broke out, he did become more oppositional, especially in private. And if you look again at the table talks and other kinds of things, there's actually a book about Hitler's architectural drawings that he and his friend architects drew up during World War II to try to rebuild the German cities, which are being bombed during the war and such. And what's interesting about those architectural plans is no churches in them. So he wanted to save any kind of churches that had not got bombed out, just as for his architectural splendor. But he wasn't interested in the churches themselves. And while I was doing research for my book, Hitler's Religion, I came across this really interesting photo of Hitler leaving a church. And there actually are two versions of this photo, and that's what fascinated me when I discovered this. One version has this white cross right over Hitler's head that makes it look like, gives him kind of this halo effect. And Hitler's private photographer who took that photo made some comment underneath it in the caption about how this was a chance event, showing Hitler, coming out of this church and everything. Well, later on, Hitler had that cross airbrushed out of the photo so that it wouldn't look like he was sort of connected to Christianity. And this was by 1937. And the caption changed too. It says that Hitler was sightseeing in this historic church, making it clear that he hadn't gone to a church service, that he was just looking at the architecture there, and the cross is removed. So Hitler, by the mid-1930s, was clearly wanting to distance himself from the churches. And after World War II, it seems clear he would have tried to do even more to undermine the churches. During the war, they did arrest a lot of Catholic priests. They arrested members of the Confessing Church, which is a Protestant wing that was opposed to the Nazis. And so there were a lot of Protestant pastors and Catholic priests who were in Nazi concentration camps as well during the late 1930s and especially in the early 1940s.
So I got into a discussion at one point with a Catholic who was going to disprove Protestantism. And the way she went about it was she drew a direct line between the anti-Semitism of Martin Luther and the anti-Semitism of Adolf Hitler, saying that Hitler got it from, amongst other places, Martin Luther. Was there a line between Hitler and Luther? Did Hitler ever reference Luther in his works, or was that not really one of Hitler's influences?
Hitler really never referenced Luther's anti-Semitism. He does reference Luther, but very rarely. And of course, Hitler was Catholic. Hitler grew up Catholic. Hitler was not Lutheran. He remained Catholic to his dying day, even though he didn't believe in Catholicism. But again, for political purposes, he did. Although some of his other associates, like Himmler and others, withdrew from the Catholic Church during the Nazi period. But Hitler never did, again, for political purposes. But Hitler was a Catholic. And the notion that the Nazi anti-Semitism came directly from Luther is erroneous in a number of ways. One is that there's anti-Semitism was pretty prominent within Catholic circles as well, especially this person trying to argue against Catholic anti-Semitism. If you look in Catholic countries like Poland and other places, anti-Semitism was just as bad or worse than it was in Germany during that period. Also, Luther was basing his anti-Semitism on religious differences with the Jews, not racial differences with the Jews. Luther thought the best thing that could happen would be if Jews would convert to Christianity. Hitler thought that the worst thing that could happen would be for Jews to convert to Christianity, because then they would be integrated into the German people, and they would pass on what Hitler saw as their bad genes onto the German people. And so Hitler thought it was a bad thing for Jews to convert to Christianity and become part of the German people. And so Hitler has based his entire anti-Semitism on race, not on religion. So although there are some, although Luther was unfortunately very opposed to the Jews and talks about burning their synagogues and driving them out of the thing, and he clearly did, this was not unique to Luther. In fact, it had actually been done by Catholics before that time. During the Crusades, there'd been major episodes against the Jews, as well as many other pogroms which had gone on throughout medieval Catholicism too. So Luther wasn't unique in that. It's unfortunate that he continued that particular perspective, in my view. And there's no evidence that Hitler was drawing on that. And Hitler's anti-Semitism, again, because it was racially motivated, was fundamentally different from Luther's religiously motivated intolerance.
So Hitler's his belief of race was Aryan, which I believe is blonde hair, blue-eyed.
Yes, that was their ideal. Yes.
How did Hitler reconcile that with being black-haired?
Interestingly, Hitler, as well as most racial theorists in Germany at the time, recognized that most Germans were mixed of races. And when I say mixed race, I mean mixed of European stocks. They basically thought there were 6 major European races. And the Aryans or Nordic, they used both terms interchangeably. The Aryan or Nordic race they considered the superior one. And they thought that most Germans had a predominance of Aryan or Nordic blood. Hitler thought that he himself had more Aryan or Nordic blood than anything else as well, but that there was a mixture there that could have caused his dark hair. But interestingly, they generally tried to get around that, usually by claiming that the most important biological features distinguishing the Aryans and Nordics from other races, including the Jews, would be mental or intellectual characteristics, or even moral characteristics, which they thought were inherited. They thought moral characteristics like being greedy or being frugal, that those would be genetically ingrained in a person through heredity. And so Hitler believed that mentally he had what it took to be Nordic and Aryan, even though he didn't have the blonde hair.
Interesting that Hitler thought he was morally there.
Oh, yeah. Hitler thinks that he's morally superior because, again, he's trying to advance human evolution, which he thinks is what brings moral superiority. And yeah, it's ironic, you're right. But Hitler believed that the Jews were immoral because he thought that they had biologically ingrained greed, lasciviousness, deceit, whereas the Germans were honest and hardworking and other things. And so he basically thinks that Hitler basically thought the Germans were moral, the Jews are immoral, and that then justifies getting rid of the immorality by killing them.
So I wanted to briefly ask about one other prominent member of the Third Reich. Was reading a bit in Peter Longerich's biography of Heinrich Himmler for a novel I was trying to write, and it said that Himmler sought the de-Christianization of German society to the point where he seemed to countenance a return to belief in the old Nordic gods, and there seemed to be an occult connection, at least with Himmler. Were Himmler's beliefs different than Hitler? Did Hitler ascribe to some of Himmler's ideas? How did their ideologies intersect or not intersect?
Yeah, the Nazis weren't agreed on this issue of the occult and neo-paganism and such. So there were some, like Himmler, who you mentioned, also Rudolf Hess and Rosenberg, who were very tied to neo-paganism and also astrology and the occult and other kinds of things like that. Whereas Hitler and Goebbels and Heydrich were very opposed to the occult, horoscopes, and neo-paganism. And there's an interesting thing that took place in relation to that I relate in my book, Hitler's Religion, where when Rudolf Hess fled to Scotland in May of 1941 to try to broker a deal with the British, Hitler just thought he'd gone nuts. And Hitler blamed the astrologers for that having happened. And so Hitler ordered Himmler and the SS to round up the astrologers throughout Germany and to throw them in concentration camps. And so Himmler does that. But at the same time, Himmler takes one of the leading astrologers who'd just been arrested and decides that this guy can become his personal astrologer. And so this one guy gets out of the concentration camp to become Himmler's personal astrologer, while all the other astrologers are being thrown in concentration camp because of Hitler's orders there. So Hitler and Himmler were not of one mind on that particular issue about astrology, neo-paganism, and other things like that. It's true that that Himmler was trying to set up neo-paganism and incorporated various neo-pagan things into the rites and ceremonies of the SS. And you'll see all sorts of documentaries and such, making a lot of that the occult side of the Nazis. But that was only one wing of the Nazis. There are other elements of the Nazis, including Hitler himself, who rejected that kind of occultism and neo-paganism.
So if you had to pick a top few of the modern misconceptions about Hitler's belief systems, what would you say the top few are today?
Well, among Christians, I think one of the leading misconceptions is that Hitler was an atheist. And I don't think that's true. I've never been able to find any evidence that he denied the existence of God altogether. He speaks a lot about providence and about how he thinks providence has, created and, saved him at various times historically and such. And so there does seem to be this vague sense of there being a God, but it's not the personal God of Christianity. Again, I think it's closest to pantheism if we can nail Hitler down to anything. It might be panentheism too, by the way, which is another view close to pantheism, but not quite the same. And I don't want to get into the details of that right now. But anyway, the notion that Hitler was an atheist, that's one, I think, misconception. Another misconception is that Hitler was an occultist, which we just talked about. The other misconception is that Hitler was a Christian. That's very prominent among atheists. Claiming that Hitler was a Christian. And again, they'll use these different vague references of his to God and to Jesus. What's interesting is that all of those references that they have are ones when Hitler was still before Hitler came to power, when he was trying to use his propaganda tools to win over people who might identify as Christians. But he himself privately, even at those times, and then certainly after he comes to power, makes pretty clear that he rejects Christianity altogether. In fact, at one point in his table talks, he refers to Christianity as being completely insane. He uses that term insane, thing that was concocted by people. And so Hitler totally dispenses with Christianity. And as I already mentioned earlier, right at the beginning of this time, he rejected the Old Testament. He rejected the Pauline epistles. He rejected most of Christianity. And even though he did think that Jesus was a heroic figure, he doesn't conceive of him in any way that's similar to what Christianity embraces about Christ. He doesn't see him as being a divine figure. He thinks that the crucifixion was a tragic event where Jesus dies, and that's pretty much it. He doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, for example.
So he's not a Christian. He's not an atheist. The closest we could say is that he's a pantheist.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, again, it's hard to nail him down. And, I am not, if someone wants to debate over whether he's a pantheist or a panentheist or, other kinds of things that might be close to those, I think those could be debated. But I think pantheism is probably the closest thing we can come to. He does seem to think that nature is God, and he talks about nature an awful lot as having divine kind of characteristics and attributes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and discussing these issues. Is there somewhere people can go if they want to find more of your material?
Well, Discovery Institute has a couple of websites up, www.darwintohitler.com com, but on Discovery Institute's websites, they have things. I have a website at my university, but it doesn't really, it goes, as my professional vita, but it doesn't give a lot of information about my different books and everything. But I also have a number of YouTube. If you go to YouTube and just search for my name, I have a bunch of YouTube lectures and talks that I've given, as well as, I think you mentioned a film that Discovery Institute did on biology of the Second Reich, which is one that I'm interviewed in a good bit as well. So those are some places you could go to look for other material.
Well, thanks again for joining us, folks. Check out Dr. Weikart's latest books. That wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only apologetic satire site. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.